Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs, and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
All right. Good morning again, everyone. Welcome. It's wonderful to be here with you today. My name is Aaron Brockett. The very briefest bit about me is I'm the mayor of Boulder. Been doing that for 2.5 years, and I'm the city council for a few years before that. But my day job was in tech. I had a software development business for 20 years, which is good for this panel because it's a tech panel. So today is Friday, April 12th, 2024. It is 10:30 a.m., well, 10:32 anyway, and this is panel number 17948. And we're going to be talking today about technology, ethics, and privacy. It's going to be a fascinating discussion. But before we get started, I'd like to tell you that the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. And we will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, educating and conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge. Consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive to support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is both inclusive and respectful. So one other thing I'd like to mention is that we want to make sure that you get a chance to ask questions. Here's how we'll handle the Q&A. We'll reserve the end of the discussion for that Q&A, and I'm going to make sure and leave ample time for that. So we're using a note card system to receive questions from the audience. At any time in the session, simply raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers here today. Please write legibly. These eyes aren't getting any younger. If you are a student, please note this in your question on the card. When you finish, raise your hand and hand it to the producer who will bring it up to me, and I urge everyone to make your questions brief and to the point. All right, and now we're going to get started. I'm going to do a brief introduction of each panelist, but you can read their entire bios on the CWA website. So from right to left, we have here Elliot Pepper. Say hi, Elliot. So Elliot is the author of 11 novels of speculative fiction, which I'm really looking forward to reading. We were talking about that a little bit earlier. But has done many other things, including creation of games, the writing of short stories, and has even overseen the production of one of his stories into a work of stage. Looking forward to hearing from Elliot today. His most recent book involves security around the semiconductor industry. Sounds really fascinating. All right, and then we have Christine Cheng, who is a PhD candidate at the CU Boulder right here. Really pleased to have you here today. Has degrees before from Cornell, Boise State, and CU Boulder, and is working on some really fascinating topics, which I'd love to hear more about, and including how humans and robots can team together, and challenging people's assumptions about how AI and autonomous systems work. And to my right here, we have Laura Harder, who is a cybersecurity professional. She's in the Air Force Reserves, working in offensive cyber offices, and also works in cybersecurity for Kaiser Permanente. But when I asked her how she'd like to highlight her bio, she used one word: nerd, which I think may apply for all of us up here on this panel. I think we could all wear that badge proudly. And with that, so the technology, ethics, and privacy those are wide-ranging and very appropriate topics for our world today. So I'm just going to ask our panelists to maybe just kick things off with maybe a few initial thoughts that kind of help get the creative juices flowing for this discussion. So maybe I'll go down in this order. Laura, if you wouldn't mind.
Privacy for me is really important in a way that I'll tell you a story. In 2004, I was in the Army, and part of that process required that I go to the law office, which is called the JAG, and I had to, in process, create a will just in case I died, right? Pretty simple thing. In 2004, somebody went into that office and stole all the hard drives from those computers. My social security number, all the information about my family, including my daughter, were in there. And it felt like a violation, right? We had physical security. There were guards, right? They guarded the base. There were guards that guarded the buildings. There was locks. And all of those protections that we think about that provide physical security to these assets were broken. Well, today, our privacy is affected in the same way, but affected through digital means. And not just from somebody stealing it, not just the bad guys. This is not a doom and gloom bad guy conversation, but because our data is being sold. Your data, anything that you've posted on the internet since 2009 is on the internet. As a result of all the artificial intelligence tools that have been trained recently, that information was used to train AI models. You may not, and you probably didn't know that your information was being used in that way. Today, social media companies like Google and Meta and Apple have changed the terms and conditions to say something very clearly that essentially says that your information can be used to train models. But if you didn't know that, and this is the first time you've ever heard of it, then maybe you will change the way that you behave on the internet. There is no federal law to provide you privacy. There's no holistic law. The European Union has GDPR, and 15 states in the United States offer some semblance of a privacy law. A lot of states are trying to bring in new laws, but unfortunately there just isn't a holistic one, and they're very disparate. We talked earlier within the panel about kind of what that looks like. Colorado is one of the states that does have a privacy law. They actually came in 2023 to establish one, put it on the books, which is fantastic. However, most of these states only cover the constituents inside of the state. So if you are not a Californian, you're not covered by CCPA, which is the California Protection Act. Today, the way that we try to hold companies responsible is through fines. But fines really are very challenging. In 2018, Facebook was faced with a $5 billion fine by the misuse of their privacy information. Facebook has not stopped operating, and they don't operate very differently than they did back then. So as a society, it's one of those questions about how do we merge the needs of the people, the technology they use, the laws that exist, and make it in a way that is going to protect you and your personal information.
That's great. Christine?
Hi, I'm very excited to be speaking with all of you today. I think Laura gave a really great overview of kind of the current state of privacy in this country, especially. I look at privacy from a few different angles. So as someone who researches computer science, I do research in robotics and AI. I certainly rely to some extent on data that has been retrieved from the internet. I'm using large language models. I'm using ChatGPT in my research right now. And so, that is one aspect of how I'm looking at privacy. Like, yes, I wholeheartedly believe that we need to be thinking much more seriously about how our data is being used. And we need to figure out how to use it ethically and appropriately so that we can continue doing, research that is paving the way for future technologies. I also think about our vulnerable populations, particularly the elderly and children. Recently, there was a task force formed at the federal level to discuss kids' online health and safety. They're working to figure out how we can protect kids online. Excuse me. And we also need to be thinking about this from the perspective of the elderly, who are especially vulnerable, who may not have the technical literacy that the younger generations do, Laura was telling us a story earlier about people who have had their savings drained because they were tricked into believing that their children or other people that were close to them needed funds, and this was done because their privacy was compromised. So I think one of the key questions that I hope we can kind of discuss today is, to what extent do we have the right to privacy? I think this is kind of a tricky question, because my knee-jerk reaction is like, well, to every extent, right? I have every right to privacy for anything that I want. But we can think about different situations in which privacy can be in which our private data could be very useful for solving a crime, for making sure that we can use facial recognition to find a kidnapper, things like this. So this is a super broad area, and I hope we can kind of dive into a lot of these different questions.
So, I think it's sort of interesting when you talk about technology and privacy. Often the terms of the discussion seem to assume that privacy is a concrete, static thing, and that technology is changing, and therefore it is threatening this concrete, static thing that we have called privacy. And the thing that I think is particularly weird is that what privacy is just as malleable as what technology is. That it's actually, like, privacy is actually a socially mediated definition. It's like our expectations about what information about ourselves is shared with whom, right? So as an example, I grew up in Oakland, in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's a big urban place, right? When I visit my cousins who live in a small town, I am horrified by their lack of privacy, right? Like, everybody knows everything about everyone, right? And I think that people going the other direction, right? Like, if you come from a small town and you move to a big city, sometimes it can feel disconcertingly anonymous and strange for that reason. Likewise, expectations around privacy vary a lot by your cultural history. We were actually talking in the green room before coming out here about how if you talk to, my dad is Dutch, if I talk to my cousins in Europe about, what their what should be shared or not shared with other people, they have very, very different baseline expectations than Americans do, and sometimes it comes out in like funny ways, right? So I think something to acknowledge here is that privacy is evolving. Like, what privacy means to us is evolving. Now, on the how is changing technology influencing our changing definition of privacy? Well, I'd be really interested for your two sort of takes on that. But when I think about it, there are like two fundamental things that have really shifted in the past century that are bringing this, that are the reason why we're having a panel on this topic. One is network computers, and two is sensor technology. So if you think, if you go back a couple hundred years, if you wanted to know information about someone, how would you get it, right? Well, you literally, you could steal their mail, right? And we've actually had very strict laws on stealing mail in the United States for a very long time that have actually influenced some of the legislation about digital information. Or you would have to literally spy on them, right? Like, you could break into their home, you could search through their drawers, and beyond that, or I guess you could also interview people who know them, right? So at least that's where I would start if I was trying to stalk someone in the 1800s. But today, two important things that have changed is now cameras have become so cheap that they're everywhere, right? Like, people have them on their doorbells, and it's useful to have it on your doorbell. Oh, is it just is it the Amazon Prime delivery guy dropping something off, or is it my friend showing up for dinner? Now I don't have to stop folding the laundry to go check the door, right? We chose to put those on our doorbells. We all carry cameras around in our pockets. It's not just cameras, though. Every kind of sensor, whether it's sensing sound, anything on the electromagnetic spectrum, heat, Satellite sensing has gotten so good that we just have these like really cheap sensors all over the world that are monitoring the world, mostly, or at least a lot of the time, for very useful reasons, right? Because we want to make sure we know where the wildfire is going to go, or we want to make sure that we can snap a pic of our grandkids, right? But now they're everywhere. So if they're everywhere all the time, it means that the world is at least potentially under constant surveillance, right? And then the related development has been network computers, that we didn't just invent computers, but we stitched them together. And they can talk to each other all the time. And computers have now become so cheap that they're also the thing we carry around in our pocket, and we are baking them into almost every other object that humans manufacture. So, your fridge is a computer, your car is a computer, your doctor's office is a computer, your house is a computer. Basically, like any human manufactured thing is now a computer. All of those computers have software. All of that software presents a huge membrane for vulnerability for people, whether they are acting in your best interest and with your consent or otherwise, to access the logs of what that computer knows about what it's been doing, right? And so I think that those two shifts are an important part of putting this in perspective. And you can see how there are feedback loops between these two things, that as we discover useful things for our sensors and for our network computers, like for example, I have an iPhone, and when I'm like traveling with my wife and we're like going off to different places in a new city, it is very helpful to turn on share your location, right? Where I can open a map and see where she is all the time and vice versa. But that's because I did it. I chose to do it. So it doesn't make me feel bad. I'm like, oh, this is great, right? But if someone else is able to access our location all the time without our knowledge, that feels very different to me. And so I think that's sort of the terms on which this discussion is taking place. And I think it's going to get very weird going forward, because that expansion of sort of the software membrane between everything we do and the world is getting bigger and bigger, which means it's more and more useful to us, and there are more and more opportunities for other people to leverage the information trail we're creating with every single thing we do.
Thanks for that for all of you. A lot of thought-provoking stuff. I thought I'd follow up on something that Christine mentioned, which is, what exactly right to privacy do we have? And Elliot, appreciated you speaking about the malleability of privacy and how it's changing over time. I think of my kids, they're 18 and 21. They have no expectations of privacy, essentially. My 21-year-old's like, yeah, everybody knows everything about me. And she's just that's the water she's swum in since she was little. So how would we define that? Where do you all see that boundary of what right do we have to privacy? I mean, I think all of us would say nobody can stick a camera in the shower, right? But that there are other rights that we would trade away pretty easily. So where do you see that boundary line? I'll throw that open to you, all of you.
In the United States, having a very United States-centric thought process on this, if I was king of the world for the day, right, I would want privacy over where my location is. I would want to have privacy over my financial information and all of the things that are encompassed in my financial information, which includes my social security number. I wouldn't want that to be divulged. But today, we can see all of those pieces of information. I loved, Elliot, that you mentioned the cameras and the sensors. But one of the things that we struggle with today just in the environment is called stalkerware. And what this is essentially technology that uses that location device, but in a way that you don't mean to, right? My daughter has been listening to me talk about cybersecurity since she was little. And she was working in retail. Somebody came into the office and had plugged in one of those little chargers, right, to charge their phone. And she looks at it pensively, and she's like, this looks weird. Something looked wrong, right? So I said, great. Bring it, right? So she text messaged me about it, and I was like, bring it home. And so I took it apart, and inside of it, there was a Bluetooth sensor there has an SD card. It was capturing images. And so somebody in this woman's life essentially had given her a phone charger that was a camera, and it was spying on her at all times. This is a 18-year-old female, right? But the risk is not just, can you see me? Because obviously with a device like that you would never know, right? This could be in your Airbnb. This could be in your home. You could just, right? This is a whole economy of things. But then there's the Apple AirTag issue, which was a big problem 2 years ago. Essentially, people in romantic relationships were putting Apple AirTags on their person's car, for example, and tracking them. And as a result, now Apple has a thing is if you're close to somebody and an Apple AirTag is near you, it will now notify you, hey, like, do you know that this is happening, right? It's supposed to help notify you. But if you have an Android phone, you don't know that, right? So if you happen to have an Android phone and you're being tracked by one of these trackers. So as a woman, right, in this world today, I would really like to not be stalked. I think that that would be really fantastic. But there's economy of this, right? There are things that will track your keystrokes to try to get your passwords. There are items like the video cameras. There are items like trackers for your person. And all of these things are existing. Well, that there's even an economy for this is really problematic because it is not with good intentions. Those sensors, right? The sensors that we have around cities are to help us know if, you're parked illegally, or if you ran a red light, or, something towards the help of society as a whole. So if it was me and I was king of the world, I would have way more privacy than I do today.
Other thoughts?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think we can all agree to make Laura king of the world. I think that would really, if we have one outcome from this panel, that should be it.
All in favor?
Yeah, exactly. You already have the mayor's vote.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's, so I think that actually your example of your daughter is instructive, because she may say that she has no expectation of privacy, but I doubt she includes her social security number in that, right?
Only because she doesn't know it.
Right, well, no, but that's what I mean, like her expectation,
Yeah.
right? Like, and so I think that different generations who are using technology differently have very different expectations of privacy, and when she's answering that question to her dad, like, maybe relatively she has no expectation of privacy, but there still are some things like access to your bank account, access to all of these things, which we still assume, even if you are, let alone just being logged, if you are intentionally posting your entire life on your Instagram feed, right? Like, even if you're doing that and that is assumed to be public, you still do have expectations around privacy. And I think that, one important sort of thing we can generalize from the great examples that Laura just gave is that there is a big difference from systems working as you intend them to, and systems being hijacked to work as a malicious actor intends them to. Right? So I think that that's an important distinction here. Like, as an example, like you mentioned stalkerware that you can just like literally buy on the dark web. But I mean, you also have issues like junior NSA analysts using their government systems to stalk women, right, and harass people. So there's a whole spectrum here. And I think that there are a couple aspects of that spectrum that are underappreciated. And they're underappreciated for the same reason that I think about a lot as a novelist. Because as a novelist, you want to try to make something, like, I have to have drama, I have to have stakes, conflict, like you need drama to make a story interesting. But actually a lot of the sort of fallout of when these systems break is sort of boring. Like, as an example, if you buy a new fridge, it's a computer, and companies that make fridges are not particularly good at cybersecurity, right? They're not known for that. Well, that's not why we don't think about that when we buy the fridge. If you're someone like Laura with enormous amount of skill set and knowledge around cybersecurity, are you really going to go work for the fridge company, right? Like that, few people do. And then, like, as soon as you've bought the fridge, they're working on the fridge's next model. How much are they really updating that software to like patch security holes? And so what ends up happening is the more different systems we have around us, like like many of them are very, very easy to hack, like insanely easy to hack, because no one's even bothering trying to protect those systems. And so many ways in which the information that Laura described being out there about you is because it's easy to scrape from systems that are easy to break, right? And I think that there's sort of a social reckoning that we need to have with the fridge company, right? Where you say, look, you didn't have to add a networked computer to your product, and you did, and now it's having these implications. Like, we need to have a new social contract with regard to how that works, because fridge companies never had to think about privacy before, right? And now they do. And so I think that's a really big one. It's where it's sort of these sort of like boring, like it's basically a bug that gets taken advantage of. And I think that the other aspect of this where there's sort of a lack of drama is in how those systems are then deployed. And again, earlier we were discussing how there's like fraud is just rampant with like identity theft and all of this stuff. I'm sure you've read about it in the news. And there are office farms of people around the world whose full-time job is to just send phishing emails and collect all of this data and then execute financial fraud. And then even if you realize it's happening, and even if the FBI gets involved and tries to investigate and prosecute it, the FBI doesn't have that much leverage over like an office farm in the Philippines. And so there's a bunch of like strange, sort of arcane, complex, like international law problems here. And it also just feels so much more removed than a bank robbery, right? Like it's easy for a community to get together and say, our bank is getting robbed by these armed people, like we need to have more police, or like we need to change bank laws. But because this feels abstract, it feels sort of like removed from our day-to-day lives, even though it's really important. It can be hard to like generate the political will to take more serious action. And I think that really that's an education issue as well, that we need to become more technically literate, and that'll be really important in dealing with this stuff moving forward.
Yeah, those are great thoughts. I do have to say I have a personal policy of never buying an appliance that connects to the internet, but I'm a Luddite in this area. Christine, do you have some further thoughts?
Yeah, I wanted to respond to some things that came up as you both were talking. So you said we need a better social contract with the people who are, designing and deploying the fridge. I think it needs to be more than a social contract. I think we need public policy, we need legislation that says here are the consequences if your security is not strong enough. Mm-hmm. And this is people, in addition to a private right of action, perhaps there's also the opportunity for the government to prosecute and these kinds of things. I also I have a cat. And we have a camera that we have in the house to like make sure that the cat isn't, doing bad things while we're away, or check on the cat while we're not home. And when I think about this question, to what extent do we have the right to privacy? Like, I kind of assume that camera could be compromised at any time. I know that. I am aware of that. I actually got an email a few months ago from the company that sold me the camera that said they did have a data breach and mine wasn't part of it, but like, who knows, right? Like, it's still entirely possible that it still could be breached and that this could be an issue. And so, I think, and then on top of that, so I do use Instagram. My profile is private. I have it set to private. I only allow people that I know to follow me and see my posts. But I still kind of assume that like anything I post could be, screenshotted and shared, or someone could guess my password and, be sharing this information or seeing this information. And so I think about when we have this assumed privacy of like, okay, I've set my settings so that my profile is private, or I've, my camera is protected behind this password. But also, so we have this assumption that we have some level of privacy, but then we also are aware that that is kind of just a veil, right? We know that, well, that's not foolproof, we see all the time about, you know, security breaches and data breaches and things like this. So I think it's impossible to answer this question of to what extent do we have the right to privacy, but I don't know. I think that one thing that we can do is push our legislators to pass much stronger privacy laws, especially at the federal level, so that it is consistent across states. At this point, you know, every state is starting to enact their own laws, and it becomes a very difficult game for the, you know, not that we need to make it easy on the tech companies, but it just makes it harder for everybody. And if we had something that was more consistent at least at our federal level, if not globally, then, you know, I think we would all be in much better shape.
Yeah, and I'm going to pick up on that because this is where I was going to go next. Anyway, we've gotten a couple good questions from the audience about action at the federal level, which we haven't had, right? I believe, Laura, did you say 1974 is the last legislation we have in this area at the federal level?
That's correct.
So what would be the next step if we could break gridlock in Congress, which is like a when hell freezes over kind of a hypothetical scenario. But let's imagine it. Laura's now president and she's worked with Congress to become functional again. What would be an important next step for them to take, you know, to do real privacy protection? Because I heard, Elliot, from you that the EU has GDPR. That hasn't necessarily been fully successful. What would be a successful federal framework for some privacy action? Any thoughts?
Oh, was that to me?
No, it's to any of you.
Oh, okay. I'll throw in a short comment, and then I'm mostly interested to hear what Laura has to say, because you work for the government. First of all, I hope we remember that Laura is now king and no longer has to worry about Congress at all. But I do think there are some lessons we can learn from GDPR. Quite a bit of that legislation has had, at best, mixed results. The fact that we now have to exit a cookie pop-up every time you visit every website, where everyone just exits it anyway and it doesn't affect information flow at all, is not what was intended with that legislation. And whatever you think about the intentions, the impact has been marginal at best. And so I think that it's actually a very challenging set of issues to try to legislate on. And if I was, lucky enough to be Laura's advisor, one of the things I would do is say, okay, why don't we start with the stuff that most people can agree is problematic. And so, as an example, I mentioned those two NSA staffers. Like, I have not yet met a person who thinks that that is okay. Right? And there are so many examples of this. Like, if you're using stalkerware that is hijacking systems built for something else in order to do something malicious to another human, those crimes need to have much, much, much stricter sentencing requirements. There needs to be much more invested in actual enforcement. We basically need to raise the priority of people doing bad things to each other that leverage networked computer systems and sensors, so that regardless of how those systems work and how, whether or how your click in a browser is logged and shared, that when people are using those systems for criminal acts, that those are prosecuted in a way that matches the level of the crime. And right now, as we were sort of talking about also in the green room, there's an enormous amount, like a lot of US financial crime law is really soft, and it was designed to be. And the internet has made the social impact of those laws being soft much worse. Right? So if I was your advisor, I would say, rather than trying to legislate what Google does next in some specific area of their search algorithm, I would say, let's start by making stricter laws that enforce against humans doing bad behavior with these systems to each other.
I'll just add really quickly. So I agree with everything you've just said, and I think that a concrete way this could be implemented is with the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. They already have mechanisms for, you know, regulation and enforcement of spectrum use, and, you know, they're the ones who are telling the phone companies, you know, how much, you know, how our phones can access each other and access the towers and all of this information, right? They're governing spectrum. And they're an independent agency, federal agency, that has these structures set up already. And I think that would be a very appropriate structure for implementing this kind of enforcement. And all of this is relevant to communications, right? All of our data is being sent over the internet, over, you know, via phone, or, you know, something similar to this. And so it's then falls within the FCC's purview.
And how would King Laura handle this situation?
I agree. Stricter laws would be great, and it would be amazing to have governance over these types of laws with the FCC. One of the challenges that happens today, if you happen to be a victim of stalking, right, especially digital stalking, it is very difficult to prove. And what we would need is essentially police departments to be trained on what that actually looks like. If you go to your local police department today and you say, I think my romantic partner is stalking me because they're saying things that I know I talked about in my email, and I don't know how they could have gotten my email account credentials, police officers don't know what to do with that, right? So they need specialized training in what that kind of privacy violation looks like. Additionally, we would need more digital forensic analysts to be able to take devices, be able to pull information from it to prove that something has happened. Recently, there was a 12-year-old girl who was murdered, and the reason that they found out that she had been murdered is they confiscated the phone of the stepdad and had found child sexual abuse material on his phone. He had wiped his phone. Now, what many people think is if I wipe my phone, the data's gone. It's not gone. It is just you can't see it because of the way we've hidden files. I happen to have some specialization in digital forensics. I can pull that data and I can see the images and I can see the texts and I can see the documents. But if we don't have enough of those folks in your jurisdiction, that device and that person who committed the crime would just be free for a very long time until they can get to it. And then the third part of it is with better laws, with better protection, with governance, and having a police force that is capable of handling these kinds of crimes, and digital forensic analysts who can get the data off of the devices. The last thing that we need is really to understand that the laws would still only apply to us in the United States. There is no international law when it comes to privacy. And if you are putting your information on a Google account, for example, and that Google account is replicated in a server in China, your information could be pulled from the Chinese government because they have laws that say we can essentially ask for that data. So understanding what you're using is that you are a commodity, right? All of you and your data have value, but where that data resides is important. So if maybe you don't want that, you would go with somebody like Proton. Proton has an email that is more secure. It's in a country that doesn't release that information. If you're gonna use, text messaging, that isn't private. If you are connecting to wireless internet that is public, your information can be seen. So it's a really multifaceted conversation. I would love to see more legislation. But if somebody commits a crime and they steal money from, say, your mother, right? Your mother got in a romance scam and she lost $250,000. This happened last year here in Colorado. A woman lost her home because she was involved in a romance scam. Another woman 2 years ago was in a romance scam and she was sending money tucked into magazines, cash money, and she was mailing it. She had been told by her sheriff's office, hey, you are involved in a scam. She wouldn't listen. She kept doing it for 2 years, and now she's a felon because she was essentially taking stolen goods, selling them, converting that into money, and then sending it back to her loved one. She's a felon. She is in her 70s. What does that look like when your 70-year-old mother is in jail for a felony? And those are some of the reasons why I really think that privacy laws, they're just so challenging.
Okay, very insightful answers. We've got a bunch of audience questions. Thanks for all the fantastic and insightful questions, everybody. And I've got one from a student here, which is, what would be the best tips that you have for improving personal privacy and data security? Your sort of data hygiene here. Any quick tips from you all?
Laura's question.
So the first thing that I do, there's lots of services that can do this. You can do this yourself. Go to an internet browser and search for yourself. You're going to find yourself on People Finder, on Yellow Pages, on all of these sites. You can opt out of it, and you can have your data removed. If you don't want to do it yourself, there's several companies that will do this for you. I actually wrote them down because I was expecting this question. So I used a Norton version. It was provided by my company. It's called Reputation Defender. There's one called ZeroFox I was introduced to, one called Incogni, and then a fourth one, there's many options out there, is called Delete Me Now. What this will do is take your information and remove it off of these public sites. Here's the thing, if your information has made it to the dark web, it is much more challenging to have it removed. Okay, so just having your credit card information and knowing and like looking at your accounts, your social security number, freeze that. From a privacy perspective, you're gonna hate me for this, but read your terms and conditions. Today, if you are using Google, Meta, Apple, any of these big companies, they change their terms and conditions and your information can be used, right? So maybe if you don't want your information shared, don't have a Google email account, right? Things like that. And then the last one is opt out, right? When you get that annoying cookie banner, the reason it exists there is that you can choose a preference and you can say you only want strictly necessary cookies. A cookie is a little file that's in your computer, and in it, it says information about you, and it gets that information from your computer and from your internet connection. And so companies can say this person is got, you know, these demographics, whatever you filled in to your, into your profile. So say Microsoft. Maybe Microsoft knows your date of birth. Maybe they know your location and they know all sorts of information about you. That's what's in that little file, that little cookie file. So when you are saying, I don't want to share that, then you are saying, I don't want information about me to go somewhere else. So if you really don't want to share your information, which, let's be honest, a lot of people just don't care, it's fine. But if you really don't, then just click the button that says, I want to do my preferences, and just uncheck all the other stuff. You don't want advertisements. You don't want your information sold. If you happen to own a home today, you can opt out of your information being shared by your mortgage company. Your mortgage company shares your information. It is we were talking about Wells Fargo earlier. This is not one of the many reasons why Wells Fargo and I have a fight with each other. They sell your information, and they make it insanely difficult to opt out. AI companies are also doing the same thing. You can opt out, but it is not easy. Like, you really have to want to do it. So those are some of the things that you can do. They're not super easy. Use a service if it's something that you really want to. If you are like an author, right, I would definitely have a service to opt out of information sharing if I were in that scenario.
I've got two other small practical ones to add
great.
to your list. We actually talked about this before, but use a password manager. Yeah. So you can just Google password manager. I use one called 1Password, but basically what this does is, so you sign into Google, you sign into your bank account, all the different passwords you have to have when you're using computers. Most people just make up something they hope they can remember and then do variations on it for every other account if you're lucky. Like, maybe they're just doing the same one for each account. There are a lot of problems with that, but like the most straightforward one is if someone gets your password to one account, they now have the password to all of your accounts. So it's extremely easy to hack you. What the basic service that password managers provide is you set one master password, which you have to remember, that gives you access to that program, and then the program automatically generates like a long randomized alphanumeric string unique password for every single account you have. So when you sign into your email, it just automatically fills in a crazy password no one can guess. When you sign into your bank account, it fills in a different one. And so even if someone was to hack your email, they can't get to your bank account. And so, you know, to be honest, they are annoying to set up when you have to do it the first time, because you have to like go and change your password in all these different places. Like I had to like spend half a day with my parents, like walking through all their accounts to get them set up. However, the payoff is not just in security, it's also in convenience, because once you have it set up, now you only have to remember one password, right? So it's much, much easier to use these systems once it's there. And then the second thing that I would just note is that so in the past couple years, sales for used cars that are basically like manufactured before there were a lot of computers embedded in every aspect of automobile systems has gone way up. And sales of dumb phones, so like old-fashioned flip phones that like are not smartphones, have also gone way up. And so I am not saying that you should try to live in the past with the tools of the past, but I do think that being aware of where you are inviting networked computers into your life and being a little bit more intentional about choosing where you want them is important, because the simplest way to understand these kinds of security and privacy issues is that if there is a network computer involved in anything, it can be taken advantage of, right? Like no matter how careful you are, at the end of the day, someone can probably get in if they really want to. And so I think that those two practical things would be a couple other good takeaways.
Yeah, and I'll just like add another nudge for opting out. It might take a few more clicks at the beginning to reject the cookies, or to say no, I don't want this app to use my location. They do it that way on purpose. We know that. It's called the friction to reject them using your data is going to be a lot harder, a lot more than to just accept everything. It might be a few more clicks. Just do it. It's not gonna, most of the time it won't ask you again. And so it's kind of similar to the setting up the passwords. It might be a little bit more work at the start, but just, it's worth it.
And a follow-up question from the audience was, do you think we'd be better off moving away from passwords and towards some other form of authentication?
Yes.
Yes. The answer is yes.
So there's multi-factor authentication, which essentially is something you have and something you know, or something you are. And so some companies today have implemented things like fingerprint readers to log into your laptop. There's YubiKeys, which is like a little USB key, and it authenticates you. So there's multi-factor authentication using your phone, which is kind of like the least strong of all of them. There's authentication with apps. But honestly, here's what happens, right? So humans, generally speaking, if you were in a previous conversation with me, you know that the most common password in 2024 is still password, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? And we've been talking about passwords forever. So again, back to the password answer. But having multi-factor authentication makes it that much harder. Is it 100%? No, it is 99.9% effective. There are still some situations, they're very unique use cases where those have been bypassed. I worked in a company where my customers hired us to try to break their multi-factor. It is not an easy thing to do in a short period of time. So you really have to be a very motivated, well-funded, right, state actor kind of thing to bypass some of these things. But a YubiKey, which is just this little like thumb drive thing, is about $60. And for most people, they're not willing to do that. Companies are starting to move towards that. A lot of government agencies, we have these things called PIV cards. They're cards with a little chip. They look like your modern credit cards. You stick the chip in, and you have a PIN. So it's something you know, the PIN, and something you have, which is that token. But it's much, much harder to bypass that than something that's single factor, which is just two things that you know, which is your username and your password.
Good. We got a few more questions, and we're a little low on time, so I'll move on. So it's a question about ransomware. Kind of what is the threat level of that right now to institutions, and is there something else that's even more threatening coming out sometime soon or already existing?
There's a ton of reports out there. Verizon comes out with their annual data breach report. It was just released this year. Ransomware is very problematic, and it becomes more problematic in places where we pay the ransom. In this last 2 years, we have seen a gigantic spike, more than 100% of ransomware attacks, and they are targeting not just companies like you would regularly go after, like a Microsoft or a Google, but they're going for soft targets. Things like school systems. A school system here in Colorado was hit recently. Hospitals, like you guys have probably heard about the United Healthcare ransomware attack that just happened a few weeks ago. The reason that this is really problematic is because hospitals have a due diligence of care. And when their computers don't work, they literally cannot treat people, right? We don't actually have those old-fashioned like medical records where we write on paper to say, hey, what's wrong with this patient? All of that is done digitally. So we're seeing a huge spike in that sense. Financially motivated attacks can be done in many ways, but ransomware attacks are the ones that are being used. And what's interesting is from 10 years ago to today, ransomware attacks have changed in that before they just wanted the ransom, you would pay the ransom, they would give you a key, you would unlock your locked computer. Now they're doing something called double extortion. So the threat actor gets into your system. It takes on average 8 minutes to get into systems. They will sit there quietly for 6 months. And then while that's happening, they will slowly take data out. They will take all of your data. And then they will say they will ransom you first in ransomware to lock your system so you can't access them. And then a second time for your data. Now, these are bad guys. Can you trust that the bad guys aren't going to stay in your system? Can you trust that they're not already sold your data on the dark web? Those are some of the challenging questions, right? And so those are kind of the things that we're seeing kind of in the threat landscape right now that are incredibly challenging to work towards. Yesterday we were talking about zero trust architecture. It's a way to like essentially say, we don't trust you, right? We don't trust users coming into our system. We don't trust systems in our system. We're gonna essentially authenticate every single thing every time, which is a new premise. The challenge is it's very expensive to implement, and the cost savings for most companies is only $1 million. And I know that sounds like a lot of money, but really it's not when you think about how much those systems cost and how much time it takes to develop them. So it's a very like spy versus spy thing. Like we're always after each other.
Well, I think that it's all like that spy versus spy thing. I mean, this is true of like any security system, both cyber and physical, is like you're always in an arms race against the other person. This even is true in your personal life, right? Like when you sign into your email, like your spam filter is always trying to outsmart the spam, and the spammers are always trying to outsmart the filter, right? And so that means that there's no sitting on your laurels on either side, right? It's like you still have to keep improving the spam filter, you still have to keep improving the spam, and it just sort of keeps going forever. I think one thing that is different now, as your examples illustrate, is that, okay, if you think about today, like, or if you think about being a musician in the early 20th century, you could be like the best musician in Boulder, and so then like, you know, all the bars on Pearl Street would be filled when your band played, and like you'd be a local celebrity, people would give you free drinks at the bar, all that kind of stuff, right? And then like each town would have their local best musician. And then if you think of like Taylor Swift today, right? She's just like global megastar. You can stream her from anywhere, and that's why her concerts like sell out all over the world in these like incredibly huge ways, because she is every town's pop star. She's every town's star musician. And the same is now true at the security level with computers, because you don't have to be the best bank robber in Boulder. You know, you can be if you have really good exploits or a really good team, really good skills and money behind an operation, like you can attack hospitals all over the world, like whenever you want. And so I think that's a big change in how we understand like the responsibilities that hospitals have to try to put safeguards in place, the responsibilities or what our expectations are as patients and as citizens, and the expectations we have from teams like Laura's and from our law enforcement agencies to be able to step in and like make credible changes. And I think that, like it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out like over the next few decades, because like there's a strong argument to be made that like hospitals having as many network connections as they do in and out is maybe not worth the security holes that then creates, right? So I think we're going to be running a lot of experiments going forward.
Well, and I will just, you said, if you have the money or the teams to be a bad actor, at this point, you don't necessarily need the money or the teams. You have AI. You have this whole other team behind you that you don't need to know everything about what you're doing in order to do something truly horrible. And so, this is yet another place that the government can step in and regulate how AI can be utilized and what extent the companies that are developing and deploying these large language models can actually be allowing this to happen.
Well, that leads incredibly well to our next question. Thank you, Christine, which is talking about this spy versus spy ratcheting up of capabilities. To what extent do artificial intelligence and quantum technologies present a greater threat to our privacy for those bad actors?
So I can speak to a couple pieces of this. The artificial intelligence piece, and if you've heard this already, just ignore me. What happens with artificial intelligence is last year there were LLMs that were established that have no guardrails. Essentially, there's no thing to tell it not to do bad things. If you go to ChatGPT and ask it how to make a bomb, it's going to tell you, no, I can't do that. Freedom GPT was released, and it allows the same type of LLM support, but without any of those guardrails. As a result of some of that and a lot of the open source work that's available, there are now ransomware as a service tools that you can subscribe for. It's $250 a year, which is really not expensive. It'll create the phishing attack. It'll help you create payloads. It'll improve your malware. Essentially, you can take the malware you have that isn't working and you could ask it to make it better. And the system will help rewrite the code in a way that would be more robust, less likely to be detected, things like that. The second piece of that is the quantum piece. Today, the reason that most of you feel safe having passwords is because it's hard to break them. The algorithm encryption that it takes to break, let's say, a 12-character password is years, right? Like hundreds of years, depending on who you're listening to today. If you have a 17-character password, it's even longer. This is called the work factor. Imagine you have a safe, and the safe is made of aluminum foil. Okay, if you have an 8-character password and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, it's like aluminum foil. You can easily open it. And as you add more characters to it, that safe becomes thicker and thicker. And once you get to a certain number of alphanumeric characters, it becomes just, in a time-wise perspective, impossible to break. To try every single combination of passwords to break it, right? So it's very challenging. It's a mathematical problem. With quantum computing, the idea is that we will be able to do the prime factors, which is kind of the math behind it, faster. So we will be able to break today's encryption, the things that's saving you from having your information exposed, in perhaps weeks, rather than hundreds of years. And that's the concern. NIST, which is just down the street, it's the National Institute of Standards and Technology, has already come out with quantum level encryption. And so companies are now taking that information, and for health systems, for example, some of them are starting to apply new cryptography to try to protect that information. So that's kind of where we're seeing it go in the future. Today, having a quantum computer is very, very, very hard. It requires temperatures to 0 Kelvin, which is very cold, and it requires a ton of energy. It is just a very hard thing. that doesn't mean it's not going to be possible in the next 10 years. There are some places that are already have these computers in place. It's just really education institutions that have them. But you as individuals, if any of you are interested in quantum computing, there are tons of free resources to learn about coding in this language. So there's some cool stuff that is going to happen with that space.
And I'll just mention that the Boulder-Denver area is a hotbed for the quantum computing industry. Other thoughts?
Yeah, so Laura was saying that, you know, ChatGPT isn't going to tell you how to make a bomb if you ask it how to make a bomb. But there's something called jailbreaking that some of you may have heard of already. So if you talk with the chatbot long enough and ask it nicely or ask it to tell you in a story, then people have gotten it to tell them how to make a bomb. You know, they found this out. Somewhat, you know, people did this audit. They told OpenAI. They've fixed that. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other ways that these models can be jailbroken. And so, you know, just because we have some of these safeguards doesn't mean that we're entirely safe. And so this is just kind of another issue that we need to be thinking about as, you know, there's more and more of these models available, more companies developing them, and absolutely no laws around how they're deployed.
Yeah, I mean, also, if you want to make a bomb, luckily you can just find that information easily on the dark web without any AI model at all.
I think it's in the library.
Yeah,
too.
yeah. So that's an issue. You know, I think that this is when you modern, organized crime today looks a lot less like The Godfather or like The Sopranos or choose your favorite like mafia movie, and it looks a lot more like a regional Microsoft like sub office. Like it's really boring. It's like people doing day jobs working at computers all day. So I actually think if you're interested in, you know, imagining how bad actors are using tools like AI today and potentially may use tools like quantum computing in the future, it really helps to just look at how those tools are being used by their explicit customers today. Like, how are software engineers using GPT-4 and other tools in their day jobs, right? I mean, like, if you write software and like a lot of the code you write is sort of like boring and repetitive because you have to just like make it integrate with a bunch of different systems all the time. So there's a small amount of your work which requires like a lot of technical creativity and deep thought to solve a new problem. And then there's a lot of just like executing the boring stuff to make that work. These tools are very useful for making the boring stuff a lot faster, because you can have the tool generate code. It might not be perfect, but you can edit it instead of having to write it from scratch over and over again. So just like all American software companies are now leveraging tools like Copilot to just write more code faster, just so every organized crime organization is doing the exact same thing. Like, their people in their cubicles are now using those tools to write code faster. And so what does that mean big picture? I think it actually, like, when I think about it big picture, I think we're actually underestimating the short-term impacts of that, because just as in non-criminal software development, like, we're at this moment where, like, if you figure out how to use the tool really well, you can suddenly like do things dramatically better than someone who hasn't figured out how to use that tool yet. So you create this like short-term huge productivity boost for you and your company. And the same is happening if you're a criminal, right? So if you're the first one to figure out how to leverage this tool to like hack more hospitals or insert bad thing here, you're going to do really well. And those hospitals are going to get hit really, really hard. And I think that like a good model for this is like in the early 2000s, once everybody really started getting on email, then email became a great target for like spammers and hackers. And so your email was like full of like penis enlargement ads like constantly. And like there are literally, if you look at op-eds from the time, people are like, email is over, right? There's no way out of this black hole. So like it was nice while it lasted. And that's where I think the long-term picture comes in, that like, I think that long-term, this really just plays out in the same spy versus spy format that Laura already described. That like, these are new tools. As people figure out how to use them, people who are trying to hack things and people who are trying to defend things are both going to be sort of unequally pushing their way to the frontier, and there's going to be some really ugly stuff that happens, and then like those things will play out. We're going to reach a new equilibrium, and somebody will invent something new, and the frontier will move somewhere else. And so I think that like we're sort of underestimating the short-term impact of what these tools can do in terms of privacy, and we're overestimating their long-term impact.
I'm just kind of imagining that regional office for the organized crime, and I wonder what like the annual review would look like. You know, so it's
There's
like,
videos. You can watch them
oh,
working.
See, I have to look this up. I can just imagine like, oh, your hacking percentage is up 37% this year. Your annual bonus will be much higher.
Oh, I mean, they actually like very explicitly borrow like KPI, like management tools from other software companies. Like it is like, it is very, very similar.
And how do you apply for one of these jobs? I'm interested. This could be the next phase of my career.
You're gonna have to go to New Delhi.
I'll do it. Well, that brings us to pretty much the end of our time here. I wonder, in closing, if you could share each of you your social security number and your mother's maiden name. But on that note, if we could just have an enormous hand for our phenomenal panelists here. Thanks so much for sharing your insights, and have a fantastic day, everybody. Thanks for joining us here.